The cathedral bells were supposed to ring at exactly 3 p.m., their bronze voices carrying across the rolling hills of Vermont to announce that Jessica Marie Castellano was finally getting married. Instead, they rang hollow in my chest as I stood alone in the bridal suite, my wedding dress a cascade of ivory silk that suddenly felt more like a costume than a promise. The antique mirror reflected a bride who looked perfect on paper, but devastated in reality. Two empty seats in the front row of the chapel below were screaming louder than any celebration could. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of my wedding started like a scene from every bridal magazine I'd ever flipped through as a little girl. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the historic inn where David and I had chosen to say our vows. My maid of honor, Sarah, was bustling around arranging flowers while the photographer captured every supposedly magical moment. But there was a sick feeling in my stomach that had nothing to do with pre-wedding jitters. I had called my parents 3 times that morning. The first call went to voicemail. The second call was answered by my mother, Claire, who sounded distracted and hurried. "Oh, honey, we're just running a bit behind. Traffic, you know how it is." The third call went straight to voicemail again. By noon, when the hairstylist was putting the finishing touches on my updo, I was trying to convince myself that they were just being typically disorganized. My parents had a gift for chaos disguised as charm. They were the kind of people who showed up 45 minutes late to everything and somehow made it seem like the party had only just begun when they arrived. Growing up, I learned to build in buffer time for their delays. School plays, graduation ceremonies, birthday parties. I always told them everything started an hour earlier than it actually did. But this was my wedding day. Surely this would be different. David found me in the bridal suite at 2:30, 30 minutes before our ceremony was supposed to begin. His face was carefully neutral, but I could see the concern in his dark eyes. He looked devastating in his charcoal gray suit, every inch the successful architect who had swept me off my feet 3 years earlier. "Jess," he said softly, "we can wait a few more minutes if you need us to." I looked at him through the mirror, this man who had seen me at my strongest and my most vulnerable, who knew exactly what those empty seats meant to me. David had watched me navigate years of being the responsible one, the planner, the daughter who handled things so my parents could focus on what they deemed more pressing matters, which always seemed to involve my younger brother Marcus and his endless series of crises. "They'll be here," I said, but my voice sounded hollow even to me. They promised they'd be here. David nodded, but I caught the way he glanced at his watch. Our guests had been seated for 20 minutes. The string quartet was running out of prelude music. The officiant, a kind elderly minister who'd known David's family for decades, had already asked twice if we were ready to begin. At exactly 3 p.m., when those cathedral bells should have been announcing my marriage, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Sweetie, so sorry. Marcus had an emergency with the restaurant. His business partner walked out and left him high and dry. We had to drive down to help him deal with the lawyers and the bank. We'll try to make it to the reception. Congratulations, love you." I read the message 3 times before the words actually registered. Marcus's restaurant, his third failed business venture in 5 years, funded entirely by our parents' retirement savings and endless emotional investment. His latest crisis had trumped my wedding day, and they had made that choice without even a phone call to explain. Sarah, who had been watching my face, immediately understood. She'd known me since college, had seen me navigate a lifetime of moments like this. "What do you want to do?" she asked quietly. I looked at myself in that antique mirror one more time. My dress was perfect. My makeup was flawless. My hair was arranged in an elegant chignon that had taken 2 hours to achieve. I looked like a bride from a fairy tale, except the fairy tale was missing the most important supporting characters. But as I stared at my reflection, something crystallized in my mind. This day wasn't about them. It had never been about them. This day was about David and me, about the life we were choosing to build together, about the family we would create that was nothing like the one I was born into. Their absence was painful, but it wasn't fatal. I had survived their absence before. I would survive it again. "We're getting married," I said, straightening my shoulders and turning away from the mirror. "Right now." The ceremony was beautiful in a way that broke my heart and healed it simultaneously. As I walked down the aisle alone, every step was a declaration of independence I hadn't known I was ready to make. David's eyes never left mine, and in his gaze I found everything I had spent years searching for in my parents' attention. When the minister pronounced us husband and wife, the applause from our friends felt like a standing ovation for finally choosing myself. But the real story, the one that would define everything that came after, began in the months that followed. Because that text message on my wedding day wasn't an anomaly. It was the punctuation mark at the end of a very long, very painful sentence that I had been writing my entire life. Growing up as Claire and Robert Castellano's daughter meant living in the shadow of perpetual crisis management. My parents weren't malicious people, they were simply chaos magnets who had never learned the difference between urgent and important. And somehow, everything involving Marcus always fell into the urgent category, while everything involving me was filed under Jessica can handle it herself. I learned early that competence was both a blessing and a curse in my family.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The better I got at managing my own life, the more invisible I became to parents who were always putting out fires started by my brother's impulsiveness. By the time I was 12, I was packing my own lunches, scheduling my own doctor appointments, and walking myself to school events because they were dealing with Marcus's latest academic probation or social catastrophe. The pattern was so ingrained that I didn't even recognize it as abnormal until I went away to college and met other families during Parents' Weekend. I watched David's parents, for instance, hang on his every word as he told them about his architectural thesis. I saw how they remembered details about his classes, his friends, his hopes for the future. I realized that most parents didn't treat their children's achievements like background noise to their more pressing concerns. My parents loved me, I knew that, but their love was passive, automatic, requiring no maintenance or attention. I was the easy child, the one who didn't need supervision or guidance. Marcus needed them, and that need felt more urgent, more important than my quiet success ever could. So I learned to be invisible. I learned to excel in silence. I graduated summa cum laude from a prestigious university with a degree in international relations funded entirely by scholarships and my own part-time work. They attended my graduation, but spent most of the ceremony on their phones coordinating Marcus's move out of yet another failed living situation. When I was accepted into the State Department's junior diplomat program, their reaction was a distracted, "That's nice, honey," before launching into a discussion about whether Marcus should try opening a food truck or a catering business. The State Department became my refuge and my proving ground. In the world of international diplomacy, competence wasn't just valued, it was essential. My first assignment was to the embassy in Prague, where I spent 2 years learning that my ability to remain calm under pressure and solve complex problems quietly was exactly what Foreign Service needed. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was invaluable. From Prague, I moved to Beirut, then to Seoul, then to a rotation back in Washington that led to increasingly classified and important work. I discovered I had a gift for languages, for reading the subtle currents of international politics, for building relationships with sources who could provide intelligence that shaped policy at the highest levels. Each assignment built on the last, each success opening doors to more challenging and significant work. My parents, when they thought about my career at all, imagined me sitting behind a desk, stamping passports, or maybe translating documents. They had no concept of what modern diplomacy actually entailed, no understanding that their quiet daughter was now conducting sensitive negotiations with foreign governments and briefing senators on matters of national security. The disconnect became crystal clear during one of my rare visits home, about a year after my wedding. I was between assignments, spending a week in my childhood bedroom that had been converted into my mother's crafting room. Over dinner, Marcus was regaling them with stories about his newest venture, a boutique coffee roasting operation that was already 3 months behind on rent. Marcus is such an entrepreneur, my mother gushed, her eyes shining with pride. He's got such vision, such creativity. Not everyone can take risks like that. I, almost offhandedly, that I had just returned from a month-long assignment in Syria, where I had been part of a team negotiating the safe passage of American humanitarian workers out of increasingly dangerous territory. My father looked up from his plate long enough to say, "That sounds stressful. You should try to get a position somewhere more stable, like Canada or something." That was the moment I realized they would never see me. Not really. To them, I would always be the daughter who didn't need attention, who could handle anything on her own, whose achievements were simply expected rather than celebrated. My competence had made me invisible, and their inability to see past Marcus's chaos had made that invisibility permanent. I stopped trying to explain my work to them after that. When they asked what I did, I gave vague answers about government work and traveling a lot. It was easier than watching their eyes glaze over when I tried to describe the complexity and importance of what I was actually doing. They were more interested in Marcus's coffee beans than my contributions to international security policy. The years passed in a blur of increasingly high-level assignments. I found myself briefing cabinet members, coordinating with intelligence agencies, and spending months at a time in places that didn't exist on any public itinerary. My security clearance reached levels that required me to be deliberately vague about my work, even with David, who understood that my silences weren't about keeping secrets from him, but about keeping secrets for the country we both served in our own ways. Meanwhile, my parents continued their familiar dance of crisis management around Marcus's perpetual disasters. His coffee business failed, followed by an attempt at food photography, then a brief stint trying to become a social media influencer. Each failure was met with sympathy, financial support, and endless emotional labor from our parents. Each of my promotions and commendations was met with distracted congratulations before the conversation inevitably turned back to whatever Marcus needed help with next. The distance between us grew not through any dramatic confrontation, but through the slow erosion of connection. Our phone calls became shorter and less frequent. Holiday visits became obligations rather than celebrations. I learned to find my validation in the work itself, in the knowledge that what I was doing mattered, even if my family would never understand how much. David became my anchor in all of this, the person who saw and celebrated every milestone that my family missed. He understood why I worked such long hours, why certain phone calls meant I would disappear for weeks at a time, why I sometimes came home with a weight in my eyes that I couldn't explain. He built a life around my career that was supportive without being demanding, proud without being possessive. We had been married for 5 years when the call came that would change everything. I was in my office at the State Department, reviewing briefing materials for an upcoming summit, when my assistant knocked on my door. "Commander Castellano," she said, using the title I had earned through my work with joint military-civilian operations, "there's a call for you from the Pentagon. They say it's urgent." I had been expecting the call, actually. For months, I had been part of a joint task force developing new protocols for diplomatic security in conflict zones. The project was highly classified, involving coordination between state, defense, and intelligence agencies. My role was to bridge the gap between diplomatic needs and military capabilities, drawing on years of field experience in some of the world's most dangerous places. What I hadn't expected was that the call would come on the same day as Marcus's wedding. Yes, my younger brother was finally getting married, at the age of 32, to a sweet girl named Amanda who somehow saw potential in his pattern of failed ventures and emotional chaos. The wedding was being held at the same country club where my parents had held their anniversary party every year for the past decade. It was going to be, according to my mother's breathless phone calls, the social event of the season. I had been invited, naturally, though the invitation felt more like an obligation than a celebration. Marcus had asked me to be in the wedding party, but I had declined, citing work commitments. The truth was, I couldn't bear the thought of standing up there watching him receive the kind of family celebration that had been absent from my own wedding day. But I had promised to attend the reception at least. David and I had RSVP'd yes months ago, though we both knew there was a good chance my work would intervene. In our 5 years of marriage, he had learned that my career operated on a different schedule than normal life, that national security didn't pause for family celebrations. The Pentagon call confirmed what I had suspected.
The summit I had been preparing for had been moved up by 2 weeks due to escalating tensions in Eastern Europe. I would need to be in Switzerland by tomorrow morning, leading a team that included representatives from 12 allied nations. The work we would be doing over the next week could potentially prevent a conflict that might otherwise spiral into something much larger. I hung up the phone and immediately called David. "I have to leave tonight," I told him. "The Geneva situation got moved up." David was quiet for a moment. He knew about Geneva in general terms, knew that it was important work involving international security. He also knew that Marcus's wedding reception was tonight and that my parents had spent months planning what they called the celebration our family deserves. "Do what you need to do," he said finally. "I'll make our excuses." But as I hung up the phone and started packing my travel documents, I realized I didn't want David to make excuses for me. I was tired of making excuses, tired of apologizing for the work that had given my life meaning and purpose. I was tired of pretending that Marcus's wedding was more important than preventing international conflict. So I did something I had never done before. I called my parents directly, and I told them exactly where I was going and why. "Mom," I said when she answered, her voice bright with pre-party excitement, "I won't be able to make Marcus's reception tonight. I've been called to Geneva for emergency diplomatic work." There was a pause. Then my mother's voice, suddenly sharp with annoyance. "Jessica, surely you can get out of work for one evening? This is your brother's wedding. Family comes first." Family comes first. The phrase hit me like a physical blow, carrying with it the weight of every missed moment, every dismissed achievement, every time my needs had been secondary to Marcus's crises. I thought about my own wedding day, about that text message received while I was standing in my wedding dress. I thought about all the times family had come first for Marcus, but never for me. "No," I said quietly, "I can't get out of this work. What I'm doing this week might prevent a war. I'm sorry I'll miss the party." My mother's sigh crackled through the phone. "Well, I suppose we shouldn't be surprised. You've always put your career first. I just hope someday you realize that success isn't everything." I hung up without saying goodbye and sat in my office for a long moment, staring out at the Washington skyline. Success isn't everything. As if my career was some selfish pursuit, some hobby I was prioritizing over family obligation. As if the work I was doing didn't matter to anyone but me. That night, while my family celebrated Marcus's wedding, I was on a plane to Geneva, carrying briefing documents that detailed threats most people would never know existed. While they were toasting his future happiness, I was preparing to spend the next week in windowless conference rooms, working 18-hour days to build consensus among allies who didn't trust each other. The Geneva summit was one of those diplomatic achievements that never makes headlines, because success in my field often looks like nothing happening at all. We prevented a conflict that most people would never know had been brewing. We built agreements that would hold tensions in check for years to come. It was the kind of work that shapes history from the shadows, accomplished by people whose names would never be in textbooks. When I returned to Washington a week later, there were 3 voicemails from my mother. The first was from the night of the wedding, her voice tight with disappointment. "Well, everyone was asking where you were. I had to keep explaining that your job is just very demanding. I hope you're happy with your choice." The second was from 2 days later, more conciliatory. "Honey, I know you're busy, but it would mean a lot if you could call. Marcus and Amanda are back from their honeymoon, and they want to hear from you." The third was from yesterday, with an edge of worry. "Jessica, we haven't heard from you at all. Are you okay? Please call us back." I didn't call back. Instead, I threw myself even deeper into my work, accepting assignments that took me further from home for longer periods of time. I led a team that spent 3 months in Africa facilitating peace talks between warring factions. I spent 6 weeks in classified locations, debriefing defectors whose information reshaped our understanding of emerging threats. I became the go-to person for impossible assignments, the diplomat they called when everyone else had failed. My parents' attempts to contact me gradually faded to holiday cards and birthday texts. They mentioned my work to friends as something important in the government, with the same vague pride they might have shown for a daughter who taught elementary school or worked at a bank. They had no idea that I was now briefing the president on matters of national security, that foreign heads of state knew my name, that my work was shaping international policy at the highest levels. The transformation was complete. I had become exactly what I'd always been in their eyes: self-sufficient, independent, requiring no attention or support. The difference was that now I had built a world where that independence was power rather than abandonment, where my competence was celebrated rather than taken for granted. I stopped thinking about them in terms of hurt feelings and started thinking about them in terms of irrelevance. They had chosen long ago to center their lives around Marcus's chaos rather than celebrating my success. I finally chose to center my life around the work that gave me purpose, rather than seeking validation from people who had proven incapable of providing it. 2 years passed like this, 2 years of increasingly important assignments and decreasing contact with my family. I was promoted to Senior Foreign Service Officer, a rank that came with its own security detail and access to intelligence briefings that most career diplomats never see. My work now involved direct coordination with heads of state, multilateral negotiations that could affect global stability for decades to come. David and I had built a life that revolved around this work. He had taken a position with an international architectural firm that allowed him to travel with me when possible, to build his own career around the understanding that mine served something larger than personal ambition. We had become the kind of power couple that moved in circles where everyone understood that some work transcends personal schedules. We owned a house in Georgetown that we rarely saw, maintained friendships with people who measured success in terms of impact rather than income, and had long ago stopped making plans that couldn't be changed at a moment's notice. It was a good life, a purposeful life, and most importantly, it was a life that belonged entirely to us.
Which made what happened next all the more shocking. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I was in my office, preparing for a trip to Seoul that would determine the next phase of diplomatic relations with North Korea, when my assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Commander Castellano, there's someone from your family on line 1. Says it's an emergency." My blood went cold. In my line of work, emergency calls from family usually meant death or disaster. I hadn't spoken to any of them in over a year, but the word emergency cut through all of that accumulated distance in an instant. "This is Jessica," I said, picking up the line. "Oh, thank God," came my mother's voice, shaking with relief and something that sounded like panic. "Jessica, honey, we need your help. We don't know what to do." My first thought was that Marcus had finally gotten himself into legal trouble, or that one of my parents was sick. But what she said next blindsided me completely. "There are men here from the government, from some kind of security agency. They're asking questions about you, about your work. They won't tell us anything, just that they need to speak with Commander Castellano about some kind of international incident. We told them they must have the wrong person, that you just work for the State Department, doing travel things. But they said no, they definitely need to speak with Commander Jessica Castellano. What is happening? What kind of trouble are you in?" I closed my eyes and felt the weight of 2 years of carefully constructed distance collapse in a single moment. An international incident, serious enough to send federal agents to my family's home, meant that my cover as a low-level government worker was about to be blown completely. Whatever was happening was big enough that normal protocols didn't apply. "Mom," I said carefully, "I need you to give the phone to whoever is in charge of the agents." "Agents?" Her voice pitched higher. "Jessica, what kind of agents? Are you in some kind of trouble? Are we in trouble?" Before she could spiral further into panic, I heard a male voice in the background, calm and professional. "Ma'am, we really do need to speak with Commander Castellano directly." A moment later, a voice I didn't recognize came on the line. "Commander, this is Agent Morrison, FBI. We apologize for the unorthodox contact, but we have a developing situation that requires your immediate attention. Your family was our most recent contact information. My mind was racing through possibilities, none of them good. What kind of situation? Ma'am, I can't discuss details over an unsecured line, but we need you to come in immediately. We're coordinating with State Department Security and the Pentagon. This is related to your work on the Eastern European situation. The Eastern European situation? That could mean any number of classified operations I had been involved with over the past year. But if FBI agents were at my parents' house, it meant that whatever was happening had crossed over from international diplomacy into domestic security. I'll be there in 2 hours, I said. In the meantime, please don't discuss the nature of my work with my family. They don't have clearance for that information. Understood, Commander. I hung up and sat for a moment, staring at my phone. In 2 hours, I would walk into my childhood home for the first time in 3 years, but not as the daughter they thought they knew. I would walk in as Commander Jessica Castellano, Senior Foreign Service Officer, the person I had become in the silence they had never bothered to break. As I gathered my security credentials and prepared to leave, I realized that the reckoning I had never sought was finally coming. Not through any plan of mine, but through the simple collision of the two worlds I had spent years keeping separate. My family was about to discover exactly who their quiet, self-sufficient daughter had become while they weren't paying attention. The drive to my parents' house felt like traveling backward through time, except I was arriving as a completely different person than the one who had left. As I pulled into the familiar driveway, I could see black SUVs parked on the street, their tinted windows and government plates announcing that something serious was happening in this quiet suburban neighborhood. I straightened my shoulders, checked my credentials one more time, and prepared to introduce my family to Commander Jessica Castellano. The woman they had never bothered to meet was finally coming home. Walking up the brick pathway to my childhood home felt like approaching a crime scene where I was both the detective and the evidence. The federal agents had maintained their positions around the property, their professional demeanor creating a stark contrast to the cheerful suburban normalcy of maple trees and white picket fences that had defined my early years. Through the living room window, I could see my mother pacing frantically, while my father sat rigidly in his favorite armchair, the same one where he used to read the newspaper while ignoring my honor roll certificates. Agent Morrison met me at the front door, his badge already visible and his expression appropriately grave. He was younger than I had expected, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of precise bearing that suggested military background before federal service. "Commander Castellano," he said, extending his hand, "thank you for coming so quickly." The title hung in the air like a foreign language my parents had never learned to speak. Through the doorway, I could see my mother freeze mid-pace, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that looked disturbingly like fear. My father had risen from his chair, his mouth slightly open, as he processed the formal introduction happening in his own entryway. "Agent Morrison," I replied, shaking his hand with the confident grip that had become second nature in rooms full of world leaders and military officials. "What's the situation?" "We have a developing crisis involving the Romanian intelligence minister you've been working with. Someone leaked details of Operation Nightingale to hostile foreign actors, and Minister Popescu has gone missing from his hotel in Brussels. The agency believes there may be an assassination attempt planned for tomorrow's NATO summit." Operation Nightingale. The codename alone was enough to make my blood pressure spike. For the past 8 months, I had been cultivating a relationship with Romania's intelligence minister, slowly building trust that had taken dozens of clandestine meetings and careful diplomatic maneuvering. Gheorghe Popescu was a cautious man who had survived 3 different regime changes by being smarter and more careful than his colleagues. If he had gone missing, it meant someone had gotten very close to him, close enough to know his security protocols. "How long has he been missing?" I asked, already running through contingency plans in my mind. 18 hours. His security detail found blood in his hotel room, but no body. We think they took him alive, which means they want information about the summit's security arrangements. My parents were standing in their own living room like strangers, watching this exchange with the kind of bewildered attention people usually reserved for foreign films without subtitles. My mother's hand was pressed to her throat, a gesture I remembered from childhood moments of high stress,
while my father kept glancing between Agent Morrison and me as if trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. "I'll need secure communications and access to the Brussels station files," I said. "How much does Washington know about my relationship with Popescu?" "Everything that matters. The director wants you on a plane to Belgium within the hour. Your cover as his cultural liaison gives you the best chance of making contact with whoever has him." Cultural liaison. It was a beautiful euphemism for the month I had spent learning Romanian folk songs and traditional recipes, building the kind of personal relationship that transcended official diplomatic channels. Popescu had a weakness for American jazz music and his grandmother's Papa Nosh recipe, details that had taken me 3 months of careful research and cultivation to discover, and another 5 months to leverage into genuine trust. "Mom, Dad," I said, turning to face them directly for the first time since entering the house, "I need you to understand that what you're hearing is classified information. You cannot discuss any of this with anyone, not your friends, not Marcus, not even each other once I leave." My mother's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Jessica, I don't understand what's happening. Who is this minister person? What is Operation Nightingale? Are you some kind of spy?" The word hung in the air between us, loaded with decades of misconceptions from movies and television shows. I wasn't technically a spy, but explaining the nuances of diplomatic intelligence work to parents who still thought I stamped passports for a living seemed impossible under the current circumstances. "I'm a senior Foreign Service officer specializing in intelligence coordination and crisis management," I said, using the official language that revealed everything and nothing simultaneously. "For the past 7 years, I've been working on classified assignments involving national security and international diplomatic relations." My father found his voice first. "7 years? Jessica, you've been doing this kind of work for 7 years?" 7 years. It sounded both too long and too short when spoken aloud. 7 years since I had stopped trying to explain my career to parents who were too busy managing Marcus's latest crisis to listen. 7 years of building expertise in languages they didn't know I spoke, managing relationships with foreign officials they had never heard of, preventing conflicts they would never know had been brewing. "The work I do isn't something I can discuss at family dinners," I said. "Most of what I've accomplished over the past decade is classified at levels that require security clearances you don't have." Agent Morrison checked his watch, a subtle reminder that national security operated on schedules that didn't pause for family revelations. "Commander, we really do need to move. The plane is fueled and waiting." I nodded, then looked at my parents one more time. They were staring at me with the kind of stunned recognition people have when they suddenly realize they've been living next door to a celebrity without knowing it. Except this wasn't about fame or fortune. This was about discovering that their daughter, the one they had categorized as self-sufficient and undemanding, had been quietly building a career that operated at levels of government they had only seen in movies. "I have to go," I said. "Agent Morrison will brief you on security protocols while I'm gone. Don't answer questions from reporters if any show up, and don't discuss my work with anyone." My mother's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "How long will you be gone? Are you safe doing this kind of work? We had no idea you were involved in anything so dangerous." The concern in her voice was real, but it came 20 years too late. I thought about all the times I had wanted exactly this kind of attention, this level of worry and care about my well-being. Now it felt foreign, like hearing someone speak my name with the wrong accent. "I'll be back when the situation is resolved. And yes, this work involves risk. It always has." I left them standing in their living room, surrounded by federal agents and the wreckage of every assumption they had made about my life. As Agent Morrison drove me to the airfield, I found myself thinking not about the crisis waiting for me in Brussels, but about the look on my parents' faces when they realized that their quiet, self-sufficient daughter had been quietly changing the world while they were managing Marcus's coffee shop disasters. The flight to Belgium gave me 8 hours to review intelligence files and prepare for what would likely be the most challenging negotiation of my career. Somewhere in Brussels, a man who trusted me was being held by people who wanted him dead, and I was possibly the only person who could get close enough to his captors to attempt a rescue. It was the kind of assignment that defined careers, the kind of mission that either elevated you to legendary status or ended your career in a classified footnote.
But as I reviewed Popescu's psychological profile and studied the intelligence reports about his disappearance, part of my mind kept drifting back to that moment in my parents' living room. For 7 years, I had convinced myself that their lack of interest in my career didn't matter, that I had found validation and purpose in the work itself. But seeing their shock, their complete bewilderment at discovering who I had become, had unlocked something I thought I had successfully buried. It wasn't satisfaction I felt exactly. It was more like the quiet settling of a long-held breath. For the first time in my adult life, my parents had looked at me with something approaching awe. Not the distracted pride they showed when I accomplished something expected, but genuine amazement at discovering I was capable of things they hadn't imagined. It was the look I had wanted to see in their eyes my entire childhood, and it had taken a national security crisis to produce it. Brussels was gray and wet when I landed, the kind of October weather that made even the most beautiful European cities look like crime scenes. The American Embassy had prepared a safe house for me in a nondescript neighborhood near the European Parliament building, complete with secure communications equipment and files on every known associate of Minister Popescu. The operation itself unfolded with the kind of methodical precision that made for terrible movie plots but effective real-world results. Through careful analysis of Popescu's known habits and relationships, we identified 3 possible locations where he might be held. Using my established cover as his cultural liaison, I was able to approach his cousin Maria, who worked in a Romanian restaurant in the city center and had been unwittingly passing messages between Popescu and his captors. The negotiation took 36 hours of careful psychological maneuvering, playing on the captors' desire for political concessions rather than monetary ransom. By presenting myself as someone with direct access to NATO security planning, I was able to position the conversation around prisoner exchanges rather than assassination plots.
It was delicate work, the kind of three-dimensional chess that required understanding not just what people wanted, but why they wanted it and what they were willing to accept instead. When we finally secured Popescu's release, he was dehydrated and exhausted, but alive and unharmed. The intelligence he provided about his captures network led to 12 arrests across 3 countries and prevented what analysts later determined would have been a coordinated attack on the NATO summit that could have destabilized European security for years. The success was noted in classified reports that would never be declassified, celebrated in meetings attended by people whose names were never mentioned in newspapers, and rewarded with a commendation that would sit in a secure file cabinet for the rest of my career. It was exactly the kind of invisible victory that had defined my professional life, the kind of achievement that mattered enormously to people who would never be able to acknowledge it publicly. But for the first time, I found myself thinking about people who weren't bound by security clearances and classification protocols. For the first time, I wondered what it would be like to call my parents and tell them that I had just prevented an international incident, that their daughter had spent the last week literally helping to keep the world stable. The flight back to Washington gave me more time to think than I wanted. David met me at the airport, his face showing the particular combination of relief and exhaustion that came from being married to someone whose work occasionally involved mortal danger in undisclosed locations. He had learned not to ask for details about my assignments, but he could always read the weight of what had happened in my posture and expression. "Successful?" he asked, taking my travel bag as we walked toward his car. "Successful," I confirmed, "and complicated." He didn't press for elaboration, which was one of the reasons our marriage worked as well as it did. David understood that my silences weren't about trusting him less, but about protecting information that could literally get people killed if it leaked. He had learned to find satisfaction in the broad strokes rather than demanding the details that would put us both at risk. But as we drove through the Virginia suburbs toward our house, I found myself breaking my usual protocol. "The FBI had to contact my parents," I said. "They know about my work now, or at least they know it's not what they thought it was." David glanced at me, understanding immediately why this was significant. He had watched me navigate years of family interactions where I was treated like a low-level government functionary whose work was vaguely boring and entirely unimportant.
He had seen my frustration at family gatherings, where Marcus's latest failed business venture received more attention and support than my diplomatic achievements. "How did they take it?" he asked. "Like they'd discovered I was a completely different person," which, I suppose, is exactly what happened. The truth was more complicated than I wanted to admit, even to David. Seeing my parents' shock had been satisfying in ways that made me uncomfortable with myself. For years, I had told myself that I didn't need their recognition, that I had found validation in the work itself. But their amazement at discovering my real career had awakened something I thought I had successfully buried: the desire to be seen and acknowledged by the people who had raised me. Over the following weeks, my parents' attempts to reconnect became increasingly desperate and transparent. My mother called daily, her voice bright with forced enthusiasm, as she asked vague questions about my important government work. My father, who had never shown interest in politics beyond complaining about taxes, suddenly wanted to discuss international relations and foreign policy. Marcus, whose entire knowledge of world events came from social media headlines, started texting me articles about diplomatic developments, with comments like, "Is this the kind of stuff you work on?" The attention was everything I had wanted as a child, but receiving it as an adult felt hollow and performative. They weren't suddenly interested in me as a person, they were fascinated by my job title and security clearance. They had discovered that their daughter was important in ways they hadn't understood, and they wanted to bask in reflected glory they had never bothered to earn. The shift was most obvious during family phone calls, which had previously focused entirely on Marcus's various projects and struggles. Now, my mother would spend the first 10 minutes asking about my work before transitioning to updates about Marcus's latest venture with an almost apologetic tone, as if she was worried I might think she was prioritizing the wrong child. But the fundamental dynamic remained unchanged. They were still the same people who had missed my wedding for Marcus's restaurant crisis, who had never bothered to learn the details of my previous assignments, who had categorized me as self-sufficient and therefore undeserving of attention. The only difference was that they now understood my self-sufficiency had made me professionally powerful rather than just personally invisible. Their newfound interest felt like being courted by someone who had ignored you for decades and was now trying to pretend the neglect had never happened. It was attention without apology, recognition without acknowledgement of what had been missing before. They wanted to be proud of me now that they understood I was worth being proud of, but they seemed incapable of recognizing that their pride was 20 years too late. The breaking point came during Marcus's birthday party, 6 weeks after the Brussels incident. It was the first family gathering I had attended since the FBI visit, and my parents had clearly planned it as an opportunity to show off their newly discovered important daughter. They had invited extended family, neighbors, and family friends, creating an audience for what felt like a performance of family pride they had never actually felt. My mother introduced me to everyone as our Jessica, who does very important work for the State Department, with the kind of glowing enthusiasm she had previously reserved for Marcus's entrepreneurial ventures. My father, emboldened by several beers, started telling stories about my childhood that emphasized my independence and competence, as if he was retroactively claiming credit for raising such a successful daughter. The performance reached its peak when my Aunt Linda asked what exactly I did for the government. Before I could give my usual vague response, my mother jumped in with barely contained excitement. "Oh, she can't really talk about it because it's all very classified and important. She works with foreign ministers and prevents international incidents. She's basically like a diplomat spy." The phrase diplomat spy was so wrong it was almost insulting. But what bothered me more was the proprietary pride in my mother's voice. She was claiming ownership of achievements she had never supported, taking credit for supporting a career she had never understood. She was presenting herself as the proud mother of an important daughter, rewriting history to erase the years of neglect and dismissal. I excused myself from the party early, claiming work obligations that weren't entirely fictional. As I drove home, I realized that my parents' newfound attention was worse than their previous indifference. At least their neglect had been honest. This new performance of pride was a lie that asked me to pretend our history was different than it actually was. The situation crystallized completely a few weeks later when my mother called with news that made my blood pressure spike immediately. "Jessica, honey, I have the most exciting news. Remember my friend Carol from book club? Her daughter works at that big newspaper in New York, and she's interested in doing a story about your career. Isn't that wonderful? Think of how proud the whole family will be to see you featured in a real newspaper." A newspaper story about my classified work, written by someone with no security clearance and no understanding of the sensitivity of what I did. It was such a fundamentally dangerous and naive suggestion that I had to sit down while processing the full scope of how little my mother understood about my career, even after the FBI visit and weeks of phone calls. "Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice level, "I cannot and will not participate in any newspaper interviews about my work. Most of what I do is classified, and discussing it publicly would be a federal crime that could end my career and potentially endanger the lives of people I work with." There was a pause, and then my mother's voice, tinged with disappointment and confusion. "But honey, wouldn't it be nice for people to know how successful you are?"
We're so proud of you, and we just want to share that pride with everyone. We're so proud of you. The words I had waited my entire childhood to hear, spoken in the context of a request that demonstrated complete ignorance of what I actually did for a living. They wanted to be proud of me publicly without having bothered to understand me privately. They wanted the social benefits of having an important daughter without the emotional investment of actually knowing who their daughter was. "My work doesn't generate the kind of public recognition you're thinking of," I said. "Success in my field is measured by things that never appear in newspapers, by crises that are prevented rather than resolved, by relationships that remain confidential for decades. The most successful thing I can do is ensure that nobody ever knows I was involved." The conversation ended with mutual frustration, my mother disappointed that I wouldn't help her show off to her friends, and me exhausted by the effort of explaining why her desire for reflected glory was both impossible and insulting. It was the moment I realized that nothing had fundamentally changed. They still didn't see me. They just wanted to be associated with the version of me they had discovered by accident. That realization led to another period of deliberate distance, but this time it felt different. Before, I had pulled away because their indifference hurt. Now I was pulling away because their attention felt false. They wanted to love the idea of having an important daughter without doing the work of actually knowing what that daughter's life was like. I stopped answering their phone calls with the same frequency. I returned to giving vague, non-committal responses about my work. I declined invitations to family gatherings where I knew I would be treated like a trophy rather than a person. The distance wasn't angry this time. It was protective. I was protecting myself from people who wanted to use my achievements to enhance their own social status without offering the genuine relationship that might have made sharing those achievements meaningful. The pattern might have continued indefinitely, with my parents oscillating between intrusive pride and hurt confusion, if not for what happened 8 months later. It was a situation that would force them to confront not just what I did for a living, but who I had become in the years they hadn't been paying attention. It would be their final opportunity to see me clearly, and my final test of whether the people who had raised me were capable of the kind of relationship I had stopped hoping for decades earlier. The call came on a Thursday morning in early spring, while I was in my office preparing for a routine briefing with the Deputy Secretary of State. My assistant's voice came through the intercom with the particular tone she reserved for family emergencies. "Commander, your mother is on line 2. She says it's urgent." Urgent. The word that had always meant Marcus was in crisis and needed immediate attention. But as I picked up the phone, I realized this urgent call was different. This time, my mother's voice was shaking with something that sounded like genuine terror. "Jessica, thank God. We need your help. Marcus is missing." Missing. Not late, not unreachable, not avoiding phone calls because of some self-created drama. Missing in a way that had prompted my parents to call their daughter, whose work they still didn't understand, but now knew involved finding people who didn't want to be found. "What do you mean missing, Mom? When did you last hear from him?" 3 days ago. He was supposed to meet Amanda for dinner on Monday night, but he never showed up. His apartment looks like someone went through it, and his car is still in the parking lot.
The police say they can't do anything for 48 hours unless there's evidence of foul play, but we know something terrible has happened. 3 days. In my line of work, 72 hours was an eternity when someone had been taken against their will. If Marcus had been kidnapped, the critical window for recovery was already closing. But if this was another one of his disappearing acts, another crisis manufactured to get attention and resources, then my parents were asking me to treat it like a national security emergency. Have you contacted his friends, checked with hospitals, gone through his recent phone records and bank statements? We've called everyone we can think of, but Marcus has been so secretive lately. He mentioned he was working on some kind of big business deal, something that was going to make him rich, but he wouldn't give us any details. Amanda said he'd been acting strange for weeks, jumpy and paranoid, like someone was following him. A big business deal that Marcus wouldn't discuss, combined with paranoid behavior and a ransacked apartment, suggested he had gotten involved in something more serious than his usual failed ventures. If he had stumbled into something criminal or tried to leverage herself into a situation beyond his understanding, he could be in genuine danger. But I had learned long ago not to trust my first instincts when it came to Marcus's crises. His talent for creating dramatic situations that required family intervention was legendary. He had previously staged elaborate scenarios to get money, attention, or forgiveness for various failures. The possibility that this was another performance designed to make him the center of family concern was something I had to consider. "I'll make some calls," I said, "but I need you to understand that if Marcus has gotten involved in criminal activity, there may be limits to what I can do to help him." "Criminal activity?" My mother's voice pitched higher. "Jessica, Marcus wouldn't get involved in anything like that. He's just a dreamer, not a criminal." A dreamer. It was the same word she had used to excuse his art school dropout, his failed businesses, his pattern of irresponsible decisions that always required family rescue. Marcus the dreamer, whose dreams somehow always became other people's financial and emotional nightmares. But as I hung up the phone and started making calls to contacts in various law enforcement agencies, I realized that my cynicism might be misplaced. The preliminary information I was able to gather suggested that Marcus had indeed stumbled into something serious. His name had appeared on the periphery of a federal investigation into a cryptocurrency scheme that had been used to launder money for Eastern European organized crime groups. The investigation was ongoing, which meant that if Marcus had been taken by people connected to the money laundering operation, his disappearance was now a federal matter. It also meant that my family's golden child, the dreamer they had spent decades protecting from consequences, had managed to get himself involved with criminals who had no interest in his charm or their excuses. Within 6 hours of my mother's call, I had confirmed that Marcus was being held by associates of the Romanian crime syndicate, whose money laundering operation he had unwittingly compromised. The same syndicate that had been responsible for Minister Popescu's kidnapping 8 months earlier. The same criminal network that now had reason to know exactly who I was and what I was capable of. Within 6 hours of my mother's call, I had confirmed that Marcus was being held by associates of the Romanian crime syndicate whose money laundering operation he had unwittingly compromised. The same syndicate that had been responsible for Minister Popescu's kidnapping 8 months earlier. The same criminal network that now had reason to know exactly who I was and what I was capable of.
It wasn't coincidence. Marcus's involvement with the cryptocurrency scheme had put him on their radar, but his relationship to me had made him a target. They weren't holding him for ransom or to prevent him from testifying. They were holding him as leverage against the American diplomatic officer who had disrupted their operations in Brussels. My brother, the family member who had always been protected from the consequences of his own poor decisions, had finally encountered a situation where charm and family intervention wouldn't be enough to save him. And the people who could save him were the same ones he had spent his life dismissing as unimportant. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. Marcus, who had never bothered to learn what I did for a living, was now entirely dependent on the expertise and connections I had built in the world he had never acknowledged existed. My parents, who had spent decades prioritizing his needs over my achievements, were now forced to confront the reality that only my achievements could address his most desperate need. As I prepared to enter the most dangerous negotiation of my career, one that would require me to risk everything I had built to save a brother who had never valued what I was building, I realized that this was the moment everything had been leading toward. Not just my career, but my entire relationship with my family. This was the test that would determine whether the people who had raised me were capable of seeing me clearly, of understanding what I had sacrificed to become someone who could save them when they needed saving. It was the moment that would define not just whether Marcus survived, but whether our family could survive, the truth of who we had all become in the years we had spent talking past each other. The secure briefing room at Langley felt different this time. Instead of the usual mix of intelligence analysts and diplomatic personnel, I was surrounded by people whose expertise lay in hostage recovery and criminal psychology. The photographs spread across the conference table showed Marcus in various states of captivity, images that had been obtained through intelligence sources I couldn't identify and didn't want to know about. Deputy Director Sarah Chen laid out the situation with the clinical precision that made her legendary in circles where emotional detachment could mean the difference between successful operations and catastrophic failures. The Dragoi Syndicate has your brother in a warehouse facility outside Bucharest. They're not asking for money, and they're not making demands through traditional channels. Our intelligence suggests they want something more valuable than ransom. More valuable than ransom? In the world of international crime, that usually meant information, access, or leverage against someone whose cooperation was worth more than cash. They had taken Marcus not because of who he was, but because of who I was and what I could provide. What do they want? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Complete intelligence files on the money laundering investigation that brought down their Brussels operation, names of informants, details of ongoing operations, and most importantly, they want you to provide false testimony that will discredit the evidence we've gathered against their leadership. False testimony that would free dangerous criminals and destroy years of careful intelligence work. They weren't just asking me to betray my oath and compromise national security. They were asking me to dismantle everything I had built in my career to save a brother who had stumbled into their world through his own reckless choices. What's the timeline? I asked. 72 hours. If you don't provide what they want by Sunday midnight, they'll kill him and dump his body where it will be found quickly enough to send a message to other American operatives. Sunday midnight. Less than 3 days to decide whether Marcus's life was worth destroying my career, compromising ongoing operations, and potentially getting other people killed. It was the kind of impossible choice that defined careers in intelligence work, except this time the stakes were personal in ways that made objective decision-making nearly impossible. There is another option, Director Chen said, her voice carefully neutral. We go in and get him. High-risk extraction, but our tactical team thinks there's a reasonable chance of success if we move within the next 48 hours. A reasonable chance. In intelligence language, that meant better than 50-50 odds, which sounded optimistic until you remembered that failure would mean Marcus's death and potentially an international incident that could damage diplomatic relations with Romania for years. What are the actual numbers? I asked. 65% chance of successful extraction, 20% chance of extraction with casualties, 15% chance of complete mission failure. 15% that Marcus would die because I had chosen the heroic option over the practical one. 15% that my decision to maintain professional integrity would cost my brother his life. It was the kind of mathematical calculation that reduced human lives to statistical probabilities, and it was exactly the kind of thinking that had made me effective in my career. But effectiveness felt different when the life in question belonged to someone who shared my childhood, someone who had been part of every family dinner and holiday celebration for 30 years, even if those celebrations had always centered around his needs rather than mine. I need to talk to my parents, I said. Director Chen nodded. We can arrange secure communications, but you need to understand that whatever you tell them will be monitored and recorded. This conversation will become part of the official file. Official file? Everything I said to my parents about Marcus's situation would be documented, analyzed, and potentially used in future legal proceedings. There would be no privacy, no opportunity for the kind of raw family conversation that might help us process what was happening.
Everything would be filtered through the requirements of national security and operational necessity. The secure phone call with my parents took place in a windowless room with 2 federal agents monitoring the conversation. My mother's voice sounded hollow and desperate when she answered, like someone who had been crying for hours and was trying to sound composed for the sake of everyone else. "Jessica, please tell me you can bring him home," she said before I had even finished explaining the situation. "Please tell me there's something you can do." Something I could do. The phrase that had defined my entire childhood, the expectation that I would handle things so other people didn't have to worry about them. Except this time, the thing I was expected to handle could cost me everything I had worked for, and the people asking for my help were the same ones who had never understood or valued what I was being asked to sacrifice. "There are options," I said carefully, aware that every word was being recorded. "But I need you to understand that this situation is more complicated than Marcus just getting into trouble. He's being held by people who want me to compromise ongoing national security operations. They're using him as leverage against my work." My father's voice came through the speaker, shaky but determined. "We don't care about your work, Jessica. We care about Marcus. Do whatever you have to do to bring him home." "We don't care about your work." The words hit me like a physical blow, carrying the weight of 30 years of dismissal and indifference. Even now, facing a crisis that had emerged directly from their lifetime of enabling Marcus's irresponsible choices, they were asking me to sacrifice everything I had built, without any recognition of what that sacrifice would mean. "There are options," I said carefully, aware that every word was being recorded. "But I need you to understand that this situation is more complicated than Marcus just getting into trouble. He's being held by people who want me to compromise ongoing national security operations. They're using him as leverage against my work." My father's voice came through the speaker, shaky but determined. "We don't care about your work, Jessica. We care about Marcus. Do whatever you have to do to bring him home." "We don't care about your work." The words hit me like a physical blow, carrying the weight of 30 years of dismissal and indifference. Even now, facing a crisis that had emerged directly from their lifetime of enabling Marcus's irresponsible choices, they were asking me to sacrifice everything I had built without any recognition of what that sacrifice would mean.
Dad, my work isn't just a job. It's national security operations that protect American lives and interests around the world. What they're asking me to do would compromise ongoing investigations and potentially get other people killed. "Other people aren't our son," my mother said, her voice breaking. "Other people aren't our family." Our family? The family that had forgotten my wedding day, that had never bothered to learn what I actually did for a living, that had spent decades treating my achievements as footnotes to Marcus's problems. Now they were invoking family loyalty to ask me to destroy everything I had accomplished in service of the same golden child who had consumed their attention and resources my entire life. "I need you to understand something," I said, feeling the weight of years of silence finally demanding to be broken. "Marcus is in this situation because he got involved with criminals who are connected to people I've worked against professionally. This isn't random. This is a direct consequence of the work I do, work that you've never bothered to understand or support." There was silence on the other end of the line, the kind of uncomfortable quiet that followed statements too true to argue with, but too painful to acknowledge. "What are you saying?" my mother asked finally. "I'm saying that the expertise they want me to compromise, the career they want me to destroy, is the same expertise and career that gives me any chance of saving Marcus. The work you've dismissed as unimportant is the only thing that makes me valuable enough for these people to negotiate with." There was silence on the other end of the line, the kind of uncomfortable quiet that followed statements too true to argue with, but too painful to acknowledge. "What are you saying?" my mother asked finally. "I'm saying that the expertise they want me to compromise, the career they want me to destroy, is the same expertise and career that gives me any chance of saving Marcus. The work you've dismissed as unimportant is the only thing that makes me valuable enough for these people to negotiate with." The conversation ended without resolution, my parents unable to process the complexity of a situation where their requests for family loyalty directly conflicted with the professional competence that made those requests possible. They wanted me to save Marcus, but they wanted me to do it without acknowledging what they were asking me to sacrifice or why that sacrifice was significant. Over the next 24 hours, I found myself caught between impossible choices. Betraying my professional obligations would free Marcus but compromise operations that protected countless other lives. Maintaining my integrity might cost Marcus his life, but would preserve work that had taken years to build and that served purposes larger than family loyalty. It was David who finally helped me see the third option, the one that required me to stop thinking like a daughter trying to save her brother and start thinking like the professional I had become. We were sitting in our kitchen at 3 in the morning, both of us unable to sleep, when he said something that changed my entire perspective on the situation. "You know," he said quietly, "this whole crisis exists because your parents never bothered to teach Marcus that actions have consequences. Maybe it's time he learned that lesson, even if it comes from the worst possible teacher." Actions have consequences. It was such a simple concept, but it had never applied to Marcus in our family system. His art school dropout had been excused as creative exploration. His failed businesses had been funded and refunded without requiring him to learn from his mistakes. His pattern of irresponsible choices had been cushioned by family intervention that prevented him from experiencing the natural results of his decisions. Now he was facing consequences that couldn't be managed by family financial support or emotional enabling. He was experiencing the reality that choices had outcomes, and that some outcomes couldn't be fixed by charm or family intervention. "What are you suggesting?" I asked. "I'm suggesting that maybe the best thing you can do for Marcus and for your family is to show them what real consequences look like. What happens when someone makes choices that put them in situations their family can't fix?" It was a brutal suggestion, one that asked me to potentially sacrifice my brother's life to teach a lesson about personal responsibility. But it was also the first suggestion anyone had made that treated me as something other than a resource to be deployed for family crisis management. The decision crystallized over the next 12 hours, as I reviewed intelligence reports and consulted with tactical experts about the extraction operation. The more I learned about the Dragoi Syndicate, the more I realized that giving them what they wanted would not only compromise my own work, but would free criminals who are actively planning operations that could kill dozens of innocent people. The choice wasn't really between Marcus's life and my career. It was between Marcus's life and the lives of people who would die if I helped dangerous criminals escape justice. It was between family loyalty and professional responsibility, between personal relationships and public service. When I called Director Chen to give her my decision, my voice was steadier than I felt. "We go with the extraction operation. I won't compromise the investigations." "Understood," she said. "The team moves at 0300 local time tomorrow. You'll coordinate from here, providing intelligence support and communication with Romanian authorities." Communication with Romanian authorities. I would be talking to the same officials I had worked with during the Popescu crisis, explaining that American criminals had gotten involved with their organized crime problem and asking for their cooperation in cleaning up a mess that had originated in my own family's dysfunction. The extraction operation began before dawn, Romanian time, while I sat in a secure communications center in Virginia, listening to tactical radio chatter and watching satellite feeds that showed tiny figures moving through industrial buildings thousands of miles away. The warehouse where Marcus was being held looked like dozens of similar facilities I had seen in intelligence briefings, anonymous concrete structures that could hide anything from legitimate business operations to the worst kinds of criminal activity. The tactical team's progress was methodical and professional, each movement coordinated through communications that reduced human lives to tactical positions and strategic objectives. "Tango 1 secured," came through my headset, indicating they had neutralized one of Marcus's guards. "Package located, preparing for extraction." Package? Military language that turned my brother into an object to be retrieved rather than a person to be saved. It was the kind of linguistic distance that made impossible decisions manageable,
that allowed professionals to function in situations where emotional involvement would compromise operational effectiveness. Package is injured but mobile, came the next update. Extraction in progress. Injured but mobile. Marcus was hurt, but alive and able to walk. The 15% chance of complete mission failure had been avoided, though the extent of his injuries and the long-term consequences of his captivity remained unknown. The operation was declared successful 43 minutes after it began. Marcus was alive, his captors were in custody, and the intelligence gathered during the raid would enhance ongoing investigations into Eastern European organized crime. It was a textbook example of how skilled professionals handled crisis situations that were beyond the capabilities of normal family intervention. But the real test came 12 hours later, when Marcus was medically cleared for travel and my parents insisted on flying to Germany to meet him at the military hospital where he was being debriefed. They wanted me to come with them, to be part of the family reunion that would mark the end of this crisis and the return to normal family dynamics. I declined the invitation, choosing instead to remain in Washington to handle the intelligence aftermath of the operation. It was a decision that my parents couldn't understand, another example of my putting work ahead of family obligations. But it was also a decision that recognized something they had never acknowledged, that my work had saved Marcus's life, and that work deserved the same respect and priority they had always given to his needs. The phone call came 3 days later, while I was reviewing the intelligence reports that had emerged from the warehouse raid. My mother's voice sounded different, subdued in a way I had never heard before.
Jessica, we're back from Germany. Marcus is home now and he's going to be okay. But we need to talk to you about something. Something. The word that usually preceded requests for money, emotional support, or crisis management. But this time, my mother's tone suggested something different, something that sounded almost like accountability. Marcus wants to apologize to you, she continued. He understands now that his choices put you in an impossible position, and he knows that you risked everything to save him. He wants to thank you properly. Marcus wants to apologize. It was such an unprecedented concept that I had trouble processing it. In 30 years of family history, Marcus had never apologized for anything, had never acknowledged that his actions had consequences for other people, had never recognized that his crises required other family members to sacrifice their own needs and priorities. The conversation that followed was unlike any family discussion we had ever had. Marcus, his voice still rough from his ordeal, spoke with a clarity and self-awareness that I had never heard from him before. He understood that his involvement with the cryptocurrency scheme had been naive and dangerous. He recognized that his pattern of irresponsible choices had created a situation where I was forced to choose between his life and my professional obligations. He acknowledged that I had saved him not because it was easy or expected, but because I had built expertise and relationships that made his rescue possible. Marcus wants to apologize. It was such an unprecedented concept that I had trouble processing it. In 30 years of family history, Marcus had never apologized for anything, had never acknowledged that his actions had consequences for other people, had never recognized that his crises required other family members to sacrifice their own needs and priorities. The conversation that followed was unlike any family discussion we had ever had. Marcus, his voice still rough from his ordeal, spoke with a clarity and self-awareness that I had never heard from him before. He understood that his involvement with the cryptocurrency scheme had been naive and dangerous. He recognized that his pattern of irresponsible choices had created a situation where I was forced to choose between his life and my professional obligations. He acknowledged that I had saved him not because it was easy or expected, but because I had built expertise and relationships that made his rescue possible. Most importantly, he apologized not just for getting into trouble, but for never recognizing or appreciating what I did for a living. He had spent his recovery time learning about diplomatic careers and intelligence work, trying to understand what he had dismissed his entire adult life. He finally comprehended that my work wasn't just a job, but a calling that required sacrifices and skills he had never bothered to acknowledge.
My parents' voices came through the phone next, both of them sounding smaller and more uncertain than I had ever heard them. My mother spoke first, her words careful and deliberate. "Jessica, we owe you an apology that's 30 years overdue. We've spent your entire life taking you for granted, assuming that because you were capable and self-sufficient, you didn't need our attention or support. We were wrong, and we're sorry." My father's voice followed, heavy with recognition that came too late to undo decades of damage. "We always thought Marcus needed us more because he was struggling, but we never realized that our strong daughter might need us too. We never understood that your strength was something we should have celebrated instead of something that made us feel like we could ignore you." The apologies were real and heartfelt, but they came after a lifetime of patterns that couldn't be undone by recognition or regret. They were acknowledging truths I had stopped hoping they would see, offering validation I had learned to live without. The conversation felt like receiving flowers for a funeral that had happened years earlier. But there was something else in their voices, something that suggested this crisis had forced them to confront not just their treatment of me, but their enabling of Marcus. For the first time, they were recognizing that their protection of him from consequences had ultimately put him in mortal danger, that their refusal to let him experience failure had prevented him from learning the judgment that might have kept him safe. The conversation ended with tentative plans for family counseling, for serious discussions about changing patterns that had defined our relationships for decades. There were no promises that everything would be different, no guarantees that they could unlearn 30 years of treating me as the self-sufficient child who didn't require attention. But there was acknowledgement, finally, of what had been missing and what needed to change. Over the following months, my family made genuine efforts to build different relationships with each other. My parents began calling me not just during crises, but to ask about my work and my life. They started learning about international relations and diplomatic careers, not to show off to their friends, but to understand what their daughter actually did with her time and expertise. Marcus entered therapy to address the impulsiveness and poor judgment that had nearly cost him his life. He started a legitimate business, funded by his own savings, and operated according to realistic plans rather than grandiose dreams. Most importantly, he began treating his family members as individuals with their own needs and accomplishments rather than resources to be deployed during his personal crises. The changes were real but gradual, the kind of deep shifts that required consistent effort rather than dramatic gestures. Family dinners became conversations where everyone's achievements and challenges received equal attention. Holiday gatherings became celebrations of multiple family members rather than Marcus-focused crisis management sessions. But the most significant change was in how I saw myself within the family structure. I was no longer the invisible daughter whose competence made her unworthy of attention. I was no longer the family member who handled things so other people didn't have to worry. I had become someone whose work and expertise were respected, whose needs and boundaries were acknowledged, whose contributions were valued rather than simply expected. The transformation wasn't complete or perfect. Years of established patterns couldn't be undone through recognition alone. But it was genuine change, the kind of slow rebuilding that creates stronger foundations rather than cosmetic improvements. My career continued to flourish, enhanced rather than diminished by the crisis that had forced my family to see me clearly. The intelligence gathered during Marcus's rescue led to significant breakthroughs in international organized crime investigations. My handling of the family crisis while maintaining professional integrity had impressed superiors who valued personal character as much as professional competence. 2 years later, when I was promoted to Assistant Secretary of State, my parents attended the ceremony. They sat in the front row, their faces glowing with pride that felt earned rather than performative. They understood what the promotion meant, what sacrifices had led to it, what responsibilities came with it. When my name was announced, they applauded not because I was their daughter who had achieved something impressive, but because they finally knew who their daughter actually was. Marcus attended the ceremony too, with Amanda and their 6-month-old daughter. He had built a successful consulting business helping small companies avoid the kind of financial mistakes that had nearly cost him his life.
His success was modest but genuine, built on competence rather than charm, sustained by realistic assessment of his capabilities rather than grandiose dreams. After the ceremony, as we posed for family photographs, I realized that the empty chairs from my wedding day had finally been filled. Not by the people who had failed to show up that day, but by the people those same individuals had become through the painful process of learning to see me clearly. The story that had begun with my parents forgetting my wedding day from Marcus's restaurant crisis had ended with my family finally understanding that my achievements were worth celebrating, that my work mattered beyond their ability to comprehend it, that my strength was something to be honored rather than exploited. It had taken a national security crisis and the near death of their golden child to teach them what I had needed them to understand my entire life: that competent, self-sufficient daughters still needed to be seen, valued, and celebrated by the people who claimed to love them. But they had learned, eventually, and that learning, delayed though it was, had transformed our family into something that actually deserved the loyalty they had always expected but never earned. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.